The ASEAN deploys military power to fight Beijing claims in South China Sea amid pandemic. In a sign of rising resistance to China's COVID-19 strategic opportunism. The typically tight-lipped Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, bloc has articulated a tougher stance on intensifying South China Sea disputes. In a major departure from its notoriously anodyne statements, ASEAN had reaffirmed that the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is the basis for determining maritime entitlements, sovereign rights, jurisdiction and legitimate interests over maritime zones. It marks the first time that the regional body has explicitly identified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as the sole legal basis to resolve maritime and territorial disputes in the region. Regional leaders participated in the summit remotely online due to COVID-19 related travel restrictions. Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia and the Philippines all have disputes with China in the contested maritime area. Taiwan is also a rival claimant but is not a member of ASEAN. The regional body referred to international law more vaguely as a basis to manage the disputes, never ruling out alternative principles and mechanisms to address the issue. By all accounts, China prefers a negotiated agreement that does not rely on United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But now, Southeast Asian countries are openly rejecting any bid by China to adopt alternative legal principles, including its controversial historic rights claims, as a basis of negotiating any conflict management regime in the contested sea. The bloc's shift is likely due to the determined efforts of current rotating chairman Vietnam, which has sought to mobilize regional unity on the disputes despite the pandemic's disruption to holding regional summits. Earlier this year, senior Vietnamese officials told this author that Hanoi is committed to ensuring ASEAN's centrality and continued strategic relevance in managing one of the most contentious geopolitical conflicts in the region. We have to work with everybody towards an optimal consensus. Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, former Vietnamese envoy to Washington and a current advisor on the country's ASEAN chairmanship. We can ensure those countries, Cambodia and Laos, participate to ensure peace and stability in the South China. When asked about Beijing's sway over smaller ASEAN members with no direct stake in the South China Sea disputes, the senior diplomat, who served as Vietnamese ambassador to the U.S. until 2018, also underscored the continued importance of ASEAN's cooperation, stating how generally we agree that the U.S. is important for this region. In terms of security and prosperity, we need the U.S. to engage different ASEAN mechanisms since ASEAN is as strong as how it is engaged by major powers. We want to be neutral, but we don't want anyone, China, to be dominant in the region too. When asked about how Vietnam will balance its national interest with its role as the chairman of ASEAN amid intensified US-China rivalry, long exasperated by ASEAN's perceived acquiescence to China, the U.S. President Donald Trump's administration warmly welcomed ASEAN's latest statement on the South China Sea. In a June 29 tweet, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wrote, "The United States welcomes ASEAN leaders' insistence that South China Sea disputes be resolved in line with international law, including United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China cannot be allowed to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire. We will have more to say on this topic soon." Pompeo's statement comes as the U.S. deploys a growing number of its aircraft carrier and warships to the South China Sea to check China's expanding footprint in the area. Earlier this month, Kelly Craft, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, submitted a note verbal to the United Nations, where it rejected China's sea claims as inconsistent with international law. The U.S. objects to China's claim to historic rights in the South China Sea to the extent that claim exceeds the maritime entitlements that China could assert consistent with international law as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the U.S. submission said. In recent years, the Trump administration has actively prodded ASEAN to stand up to China over the sea disputes. Last November, David Stilwell, US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, openly called on regional states to emulate Vietnam's tough stance in the South China Sea. This is your turf, this is your place. Vietnam has done a good job of pushing back. I would think that regarding ASEAN centrality, the grouping would join Vietnam to resist actions that are destabilizing and affecting security, he said during a forum in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. One major area of concern for the U.S. and other major regional players is the ongoing negotiation over an ASEAN-China Code of Conduct in the South China Sea.